Sawasdee krap. Good morning from Bangkok, downtown Bangkok at Chulalongkorn University on campus. We had an event last Wednesday, and it went on for 90 minutes on U.S.-Thai relations, and today we're moving on to ASEAN. Again, we have a 90-minute format, so for the next 90 minutes, we will learn and interact and discuss, tease out key themes and challenges for ASEAN. The title of the webinar today is ASEAN at New Crossroads. New Crossroads meaning, there have been many crossroads in ASEAN's way over the last 54 years. I think that at this time, the new crossroads are unprecedented. We've seen ASEAN divisions, a lot of issues that are not being addressed, and a number of challenges ahead. In the context of today, we have Myanmar's 2022 chairmanship of ASEAN. And the last time this happened, a decade ago, when Cambodia chaired ASEAN on a rotational basis, ASEAN had a bit of a hitch, a hiccup, because ASEAN was not able to come up with a joint statement after the ministers' meeting. And that was the first time that this happened. And since then, there have been friction and issues and divisions, different views among ASEAN member states about what is happening within ASEAN and about the challenges from outside, the US-China rivalry and competition, the role of China, the influence of the US. So ASEAN now is in a tight spot, in a bind, between a rock and a hard place in a way, as a single entity is fundamentally challenged. Some members see ASEAN going one way, others another way. We also have seen over the last decade the South China Sea being the front and center issue for ASEAN unity and centrality. And ASEAN has not been able to have a common voice on South China Sea. The code of conduct on parties from the South China Sea has been delayed, it's still ongoing, negotiated, but there's no set rules for governing South China Sea issues. And South China Sea is a hotspot because China has taken over rocks and reefs and made them into artificial islands and have weaponized them. And this goes against the interests and preferences of Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and of course Taiwan, and so on. So South China Sea very much front and center. But in addition to that, we've had some issues also over the last decade with the Mekong dams in mainland Southeast Asia, the Mekong region, the Mekong River, upstream dams by China, detrimental effects downstream for Cambodia and Vietnam, and also Laos and Thailand. Most recently, in February this year, Myanmar, after a decade of political opening, liberalization, economic reforms, some development progress. For one decade, the plug has been pulled with the military coup on February 1st, 2021, earlier this year. And since then, ASEAN has been divided on how to respond to the Myanmar crisis and the violence and the civil war now ongoing. Some members think that Myanmar should return to democratic process through dialogue. Others take a more passive view and a kind of a fait accompli in Myanmar. And in the meantime, Myanmar is a raging issue. The violence, civil war, it has become a bit of a stalemate, maybe intractable. So these are issues, at least three major issues within ASEAN: South China Sea, mainland Southeast Asia, the Mekong dams, upstream dams, and Myanmar coup and crisis. In addition, of course, there's outside, beyond ASEAN, the US and China rivalry and what's taking place outside with the Quad, AUKUS, the Australia, UK, US trilateral security pact, and China's owned Belt and Road Initiative still on track. So the competition is very clear. And then compounded, these issues and challenges compounded now by the pandemic over the last 2 years. And the pandemic affects all countries in different ways, to different degrees. Some will be reopening faster, sooner, but China may be reopening later So we see within ASEAN, Thailand has taken the lead in reopening, but other countries are in line, including Cambodia. So we have 4 speakers today. Audience participants, feel free to engage and write in questions whenever you like. And we'll try to keep this conversation in a crisp fashion, back and forth, not long lectures, but the key points and insights and takeaways. We're trying to tease that out. We have 4 speakers with Dr. Ching Wanarit. He's unexpectedly engaged, but he'll be joining shortly. We will start with Gwen Robinson, who will give us a recap of Myanmar's up-to-date situation, the violence, civil war, and how that all impacts ASEAN's considerations and ASEAN's centrality. And then we'll have a view from Dr. Lina Alexandra in Jakarta, Indonesia. Is the biggest member state, it has the biggest weight, and I think it's taking a lead role in a number of issues. But on Myanmar and on the other challenges, I think Indonesia has been frustrated. And then we'll look later in the conversation with Dr. Paradi Nguyen from Chiang Mai University. I want to warmly welcome Dr. Paradi in particular. She's been working on ASEAN issues for many years, but this is her first time with ISIS Thailand platform and webinar. So let's start with the Myanmar hot potato, the Myanmar crisis, the coup, and a lot of water already under the bridge. The NUG, this is the opposition's umbrella on one hand, on one side, the other side, the SAC, State Administration Council, the military junta, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, and there's a kind of a stalemate now because the opposition, some of them are armed, and they're putting up a fierce fight. So the military junta can take power, seize power, but they do not have control over the country. Gwen Robinson, may I, as a senior fellow of ISIS Thailand, also a former president of the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand, a researcher who has been based inside Myanmar for years until recently, and then the editor-at-large of the Nikkei Asian Review. From your perspective, I know you have a lot of contacts inside the country. You've been tracking it very closely. So please tell us a little bit about the update and the prospects, and maybe how this all impacts ASEAN. What should ASEAN be thinking about on Myanmar? Gwen Robinson.
Well, thanks, Dr. Titinan, and thanks for having me here today. You summed up a lot of the issues so well. So I'll try and add to it, maybe with a brief look later on what's happening inside Myanmar, but particularly to focus on this issue of the Myanmar curse for ASEAN, the impact of that, and the latest developments, how it's going to affect, I think, ASEAN fundamentally in the future. But I think the discussion will go into that after me. So I'd first like to note how strikingly ironic it is that Myanmar, which is a country that no one credited with much international influence or foreign policy power, has actually been the wedge that finally cracked ASEAN's treasured principles of centrality and non-interference. The perception is that all this recent furore has happened over the issue of attendance by the junta chief Min Aung Hlaing at the ASEAN summits in late October, and the ASEAN's historic decision to bar him from attendance. But I'd really like to argue that the Myanmar curse set in for ASEAN more than 6 years ago, and that is over the issues over the country's treatment of Rohingya Muslims, which first brought ASEAN's fault lines, ethnic and religious divisions, to the fore. And I won't go, that's past history, but I think we all saw the extraordinary expulsion of Rohingya in 2017, but the rot really set in around 2015 with the region paralysed or unable to come to a uniform decision about how to deal with this huge outflow of Rohingya refugees, initially by boat. But anyway, back to the latest developments. I think it's clear that they have created unprecedented internal disharmony in ASEAN and paralysis ahead of China's special summit with ASEAN in just a few days. And there is very credible information also amongst ASEAN diplomats I've spoken to that at least 4 of the 10 ASEAN member countries have threatened in the last few days to downgrade their own representation at the China-ASEAN summit on November 22 if Min Aung Hlaing, the coup leader, attends. On the other hand, for ASEAN and China, blocking the junta chief from the summit will create further problems for ASEAN in handling what is clearly becoming known as a pariah state, one of the worst pariah states in the world, in fact, with statements we're hearing all the time from the UN and others. And it's also likely to drive the junta and therefore Myanmar into further isolation and certainly augurs more diplomatic upheavals in the region. But just to recap, as we saw in recent weeks, this began with the ASEAN's historic decision to bar Min Aung Hlaing from attending its October 26 to 28 summits, including with key dialogue partners. And we know that some key partners, including the US, had privately suggested that their leaders, particularly the US president, would not appear alongside the junta chief, virtual or not. And that it seems to be echoed now. And we've got another upcoming summit just days after the China-ASEAN summit, with starting November 25th, just a few days of ASEM, the Asia-Europe meeting being hosted by Cambodia, which is, as we know, the new chair, incoming chair of ASEAN. Further complicating all of this, just to add the diplomatic complication, is the fact that Myanmar has just become ASEAN's coordinator for relations with China. That makes it all extremely awkward, I think, for ASEAN to navigate this difficult question. We also know that after the recent ASEAN summit, where Min Aung Hlaing was barred, Myanmar angrily rejected ASEAN's invitation to send a non-political representative in his place, and then accused ASEAN of undermining its key principles of centrality and non-interference. So, in some respects, I'd have to say Myanmar's accusations were completely correct. ASEAN has completely undermined its own, cherished traditions of not interfering in each other's affairs and keeping all decisions as a kind of central decision-making process. I think looking inside, the upshot of all of this inside Myanmar, in my view, is that Min Aung Hlaing's fury at this public and international humiliation has added extra savagery to the current military assaults we're seeing in areas of resistance, particularly in recent days or a few weeks, central states such as Chin, Sagaing and Magway. In fact, chillingly, Min Aung Hlaing several times has expressed absolute determination to annihilate the so-called People's Defence Forces, these groups that have sprung up around the country, amid indications every day that armed resistance amongst the people is steadily growing, particularly in the form of these PDF groups and an upsurge growing steadily of urban terrorism, which is including bombings and really very alarming rate of targeted assassinations of officials and anyone linked with the state. So every day now we're seeing reports of killings of officials or individuals linked to the state, and on top of that, frequent reports of infrastructure being destroyed, such as telecom towers. I think there are now at least 120 to 130 big telecom towers that have been blown up or crippled in some way by the resistance forces. In retaliation, we've seen the military launching aerial bombings and ground attacks on villages and whole areas of the countryside, particularly in the central west area, driving at least 30,000 additional people from their homes. That's for a total of nearly 600,000 people who are displaced, at least 250,000 of them since the February 1st coup. And meanwhile, as UN agencies and human rights organisations have verified, the level of repression inside is rising inexorably with, I think the few days ago when I checked, we've got 1,285 civilians killed by security forces and nearly 10,300 arrested since February 1st amid growing reports of torture. Now, for ASEAN, trying to have their very high-minded summits, I think this is a real problem, and it's becoming increasingly a problem that Myanmar is a die-hard member of the group. So it's very clear that Myanmar's ill-advised threats to mount an official challenge to ASEAN's decision to bar the junta leader have been met with a roaring silence, and it has left an extremely difficult challenge hanging over ASEAN. As many officials have privately said, the ASEAN officials I've talked to, the question of whether ASEAN had any grounds to bar the junta leader all hinges on the question of recognising the junta's claim to be the legitimate government of Myanmar. This is widely disputed, as we've seen in the UN and some leading Western countries and others. It's not an issue that ASEAN leaders have yet met head-on to really decide if the regime in Myanmar is legitimate or not. And from ASEAN's viewpoint, and particularly the countries closest to Myanmar, and we're talking about Thailand, where some of us are sitting right now, I think the situation is alarming because the real concern is the kind of violence I've just detailed suggests a very steady outflow of refugees, which could turn into quite a big torrent, and we saw that happen with the Rohingya in 2017. So I'm quite sure these are the sort of concerns that are very much in the minds of ASEAN leaders, and it's the biggest challenge. Just briefly, I'll just close with pointing out that we have also seen in the last week an unprecedented flurry of diplomatic activity. I mean, unprecedented since February 1st when the junta took over. And that has featured in just the space of about 8 days visits of high-level envoys from China, Sun Guoxiang, the envoy, special envoy on Asia, Japan's Yohei Sasakawa, who is Tokyo's special envoy for national reconciliation in Myanmar and head of his Nippon Foundation, and Thai Foreign Minister Dom Pramod Vinay, who cropped up unexpectedly and unannounced on Sunday. And on either side of that were visits by former US Ambassador Bill Richardson, linked to this release of the jailed US journalist Danny Fenster, but there were clearly many other things going on behind Richardson's visit, even though the Japanese were responsible largely for the release of Fenster. And amidst all that, we saw a high-level Russian military delegation landing in Naypyidaw and wedged in between these various meetings Min Aung Hlaing was having with these envoys to talk about military cooperation and the rising dynamic between Russia and Myanmar over both military and it's very clear now investment and some very big oil deals, gas actually deals being discussed. So I would just like to leave it there, and we can talk maybe later about the extent of how Myanmar is becoming a failed state and its economy is falling off a cliff. But I won't get too much into the domestic, and I'll hand back to you, Dr. Titina.
Thank you very much, Gwen. Thank you very much. This is very, very vivid and also concise and up to date. It's dark and it's sad what's happening there. I think many people will share that view. The one big difference I see in Myanmar, and I'm going to move to the other speakers shortly. You know, it used to be that it's not the first time Myanmar is an international outcast from having a military dictatorship, but this time the Myanmar military has basically alienated itself even from within ASEAN. Normally, ASEAN would be the intermediary, the insulation, the go-between between the Myanmar military dictatorship and the outside world. But even ASEAN's hand has been forced because the Myanmar military, SAC, and General Min Aung Hlaing has betrayed the 5-point consensus that ASEAN came up with last April. So I think that consensus, is still very much in play. I think it's still looking for enforcement and implementation. Let me move over to Dr. Lina Alexandra of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta. Our think tank colleague, and the CSIS in Jakarta is also our partner think tank within the ASEAN ISIS consortium. Dr. Lina, from Indonesia's point of view, Indonesia has been the most active. Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi, I think the President Joko Widodo, have invested a lot of resources to try to move the situation from a dark dictatorship into some kind of a dialogue and return to a workable solution. What do you see, Dr. Lina? The floor is yours. Myanmar and beyond. I mean, for the ASEAN challenges, not just Myanmar, but Myanmar is certainly the most recent. But moving forward, these are new challenges and new crossroads. How does ASEAN navigate at this time?
All right, thank you, Dr. Thitinan. I think it's I'm really enjoying listening to what Gwen mentioned earlier about the situation in Myanmar. I think we might have to focus on this issue because I think this is the priority issue in terms of restoring ASEAN's credibility and unity. We can talk about, of course, it's equally important about the South China Sea issue, COC, and how ASEAN navigate itself in the tensions among the major powers in the region. But I think this is certainly the issue that ASEAN has to deal first in order to prove to the international community that ASEAN can be united in dealing with its own internal problems. To some extent, I think I disagree with the idea that ASEAN is undermining its own principles by actually preventing the attendance of Min Aung Hlaing into the ASEAN summit last time, because it is actually consensus by all ASEAN member states to offer a non-political representative position to attend the summit. To some extent, this is actually, as mentioned earlier, this is actually a progress, setting up the precedents for ASEAN to be able to quite decisively making decision in dealing with this crisis. But anyway, regarding the frustration from Indonesia on how ASEAN has been dealing with the crisis in Myanmar, I think this is very clear. And the frustration, first of all, is directed to our own region itself. ASEAN has been very vividly disunited. There are, as Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, are quite progressive in showing our standpoint in the issue, while others have been quite conventional, seeing the crisis as purely domestic affairs of Myanmar, and of course, like sticking to the non-interference principle, which is not true, because ASEAN principles is not only respecting sovereignty and non-interference. And to some extent, sovereignty is actually what it entails within sovereignty itself is the responsibility of the government to actually protect its own people. And in this case, Myanmar, with the military coup happening on the ground, is actually violating ASEAN principles in terms of promoting democracy, rule of law, and good governance. So I think this is obviously something that ASEAN has to deal with because it's violating ASEAN's principles. And it's obviously a regional crisis. It's not purely a domestic crisis of Myanmar. But as mentioned earlier, it's also there are a lot of spillover effects especially to the neighboring countries and to the overall region, as well as like raising the very strong concerns from the international community. And as mentioned earlier, I think Indonesia's standpoint has been quite firm, as Indonesia has actively pushed for many initiatives from the outset. The foreign minister has initiated the informal meeting to discuss about the issue. And of course, our president has pushed for the special leaders meeting in April 2021. leading to the conclusion of the 5-point consensus, although it's been very, very slow process towards its implementation. And Indonesia has been pushing for an immediate appointment of the special envoy, and it has been delayed so much. And what is critical until now is there has been no clear and specific and comprehensive term of reference on how the special envoy should actually implement his mandates. What we are seeing now, if we directly translate from the 5-point consensus, it is the chair of this the special envoy of the chair. But in fact, in reality, what we should see is actually the special envoy of ASEAN. Although the chair, of course, playing a role in appointing the special envoy, but the process should actually be transparent, that involve consultation among all ASEAN member states, the nine ASEAN member states, to discuss about the appointment of the special envoy. And the previous process, it was not transparent at all. Although there was some little discussion about it, but what has triggered a lot of criticism is actually the sudden visit by the chair and ASEAN Secretary General to meet with the SAC leaders, which by many have been perceived as seeking consent from the Myanmar junta or the Myanmar military. And this is not something that is correct, because the main issue should be for the chair and ASEAN SG to convey the decisions of the ASEAN 9 to the SAC leaders, because they are actually the main problem of the crisis. So I think the key issue now here is, as ASEAN is waiting for the new chairman in 2022, it has raised up a lot of expectations from the region, especially, of course, from the international community. First of all, I think as we are looking forward for the next speaker, I'm very much looking forward to listen what will be the Cambodia's chairmanship agenda. And then I think we are curiously looking forward to know where is the position of the Myanmar crisis in Cambodia's chairmanship agenda. We know, of course, a lot of issues facing ASEAN ahead in the near future, but I think this is very important to ensure whether this Myanmar crisis will be a key priority agenda in the next chairmanship. Because again, as I mentioned, this is a very critical litmus test for ASEAN to really prove that ASEAN is actually answering to its own problem. And the other issue, of course, about the special envoy, as I mentioned, whether this will the previous practice will become a precedent, meaning that special envoy is only working according to the rotating term of the chair. And this is actually the issue, because as we know, of course we don't want the crisis to be prolonged, but as many have predicted, and I think it doesn't take a genius to actually see that the crisis will be prolonged, the term for the chair, the term for the special envoy, if it is following the rotating term of the chair, I think it will not be effective. The special envoy has to be given a longer term and also a bigger, I must say, a bigger mission, a bigger office to be able to support him or her to do whatever the mandates given to him. Of course, in the 5-point consensus, it is mentioned that the main task the main mandate for the special envoy is to facilitate the mediation of the dialogue together with the ASEAN Secretary General. But in my view, and especially from the Indonesian view, the implementation of the 5-point consensus is actually the whole package. So the cessation of the violence, stopping of the violence, the delivery of humanitarian assistance, and the facilitation of the mediation of the political dialogue among all parties in Myanmar. this should be seen as a whole package rather than a separate package. So in that sense, the special envoy should be actually also involved in implementing the other tasks as well, while focusing his or her work in the facilitation process itself. Of course, we can flesh out about this later on. And the last point that I want to mention, so regarding the institutionalization of the special envoy, I add the point about earlier. So there should be an institutionalization of the special envoy. But the last point that I want to mention is about the strategy. I think this is very important to ensure, to underline that, of course, ASEAN has been working on the consensus base, and to some extent, Cambodia has hinted that it, as a chair, it will display again the approach of quiet diplomacy. These are important, of course, but this is definitely not enough, because it is very important not to give too much concession and leeway to the junta. And as mentioned earlier by Gwen, ASEAN has been so far trying to block the presence of the representatives from SAC. I think this is important, but again, ASEAN should come up with a mid-term or longer-term strategy on how to deal with these issues. So simply not only blocking SSC attendance here and there, but there should be a more comprehensive strategy on how to come up with a better strategy on really pressuring the military junta. I think I'll stop there, and then of course we can continue the discussion later on. Thank you, Dr. Tigana.
Thank you very much, Lena. That's a very rich feedback and comments from you, and I think Myanmar is very much a hot issue, as I mentioned. I mean, in addition to the coup and the crisis and the divisions of the two sides, it seems that Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore very early on took a stand against the coup, and then Philippines up to an extent, but the rest were not so. And now there's an additional issue of the envoy, whether this is the chair's prerogative. If that's the case, then maybe the Cambodian chair may appoint a new envoy. So even the special envoy of ASEAN is a sticking point for ASEAN members. If Dr. Wanarit is on, I think there's some connection problem. Dr. Wanarit, are you there? Yeah.
Hear me?
We can
Hello,
hear you.
can you hear me?
Can hear now. Please, a lot
Hello,
on the plate for you.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Cambodian chairmanship. Go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. I have listened carefully to the inputs by previous speakers. I think Myanmar will continue to be a big agenda for ASEAN, and of course, how to find kind of appropriate inclusive solution to Myanmar will be critical. Just a few updates lately with regards to kind of the participation of Myanmar in multilateral meetings. So previously, the European Union was fine with the foreign minister of Myanmar to attend the ASEM, but later on it changed position to invite only non-political representation, follow the ASEAN. So I heard that Myanmar again will boycott ASEM, the Asia-Europe summit, will take place on 26 this month, next week. And another interesting development is the Chinese kind of a role in convincing ASEAN member states to accept political representative of Myanmar at the upcoming China-ASEAN summit, a special ASEAN summit which President Xi Jinping will attend. But I'm not sure how ASEAN member state responds to a kind of proposal from China to invite high level, let's say foreign minister level of Myanmar to the special China ASEAN summit. So that is very kind of tricky and controversial with regard to participation of Myanmar in this kind of multilateral framework. So next year, Cambodia is a chair of ASEAN, and as previous speaker mentioned, that Cambodia is very interested in facilitating the dialogue among ASEAN members, between ASEAN and Myanmar, and possibly between and among different groups in Myanmar. So under the framework of ASEAN Special Envoy, which is not yet confirmed whether the Foreign Minister Prasakon of Cambodia will be appointed as a special envoy. It depends on the other ASEAN member states, the consensus of ASEAN. But at the national level, Prime Minister Hun Sen already assigned Foreign Minister to be the next ASEAN special envoy to Myanmar. Just a footnote to this, Cambodia in the past, what I have learned is that before the opening up of and the form opening up of Myanmar back in 2010, Cambodia also played a certain role in facilitating behind the scene or quiet diplomacy to provide certain kind of degree of conducive environment to the political dialogue and reconciliation there. So again, Cambodia at this time next year, will try to facilitate this kind of political dialogue, inclusive political dialogue in Myanmar. The narrative so far by the Cambodian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister is Cambodia went through about 30 years of civil war, and under the win-win policy that was initiated by Prime Minister Hun Sen back in the late 1990s, brought kind of total peace to Cambodia and national unity and reconciliation. It was the first time in the about 500 years history of Cambodia that the country was fully united under one government, one constitution, and one territory. So that is an inspiration for Cambodian leadership to share it best practices when it comes to national reconciliation and peacemaking and peace building process. So that is the kind of the national dimension of the Cambodia role as a chair of ASEAN in Myanmar issue. And of course, we need to recognize the roles of Japan, which is very actively involved in the process, and of course China in this regard. There's slightly different different way and method between Japan and China with regards to the Myanmar issue, but they are both have strong interest in kind of restoring peace and stability there. So let's see how China and Japan can influence Cambodia as a chair next year. I think that the process have been taken place, the kind of deep engagement of China and Japan in Cambodia already in preparing for taking chairmanship next year. So now is the internal process of ASEAN, consensus building within ASEAN itself, how Cambodia can build a kind of consensus with countries like in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, which have kind of strong views on Myanmar issue. So there's some division or gap between maritime Southeast Asia and mainland Southeast Asia with regards to the Myanmar. So I personally doesn't wish to see Myanmar as a dividing issue for ASEAN, but rather a uniting issue that can unite ASEAN. So it depends on how ASEAN can build consensus on Myanmar and how they can effectively address Myanmar issues. And another level is ASEAN UN partnership, because ASEAN UN partnership is very influential and crucial in conflict resolution, preventive diplomacy. So in this case, I think ASEAN need to work closely with the UN, especially United Nations Security Council, to find a kind of a political breakthrough in certain way to Myanmar. And some have alluded to the Paris Peace Agreement that Cambodia used to experience the four fighting faction Cambodia before reaching the Paris Peace Agreement with the participation of the the 5 permanent members of the Security Councils, and also key regional actors, especially Indonesia, in this case, of Cambodia during the Paris Peace Accord. So Cambodia next year will try to revive the ASEAN Global Dialogue and perhaps find some way to build ASEAN UN partnership or collaboration to deal with the Myanmar issue. I just would like to end here. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Wanarit. I'm just going to follow up a little bit here. Is this going to be, Prime Minister Hun Sen, this will probably be the last time he chairs ASEAN as a leader of Cambodia. Is he looking for a legacy, and would that legacy be the Myanmar political settlement inspired by his own experience with the Paris peace talks leading to the Cambodian settlement and peace arrangement? That's one issue. What's Prime Minister Hun Sen thinking? What does he want to get out of Cambodia's chairmanship? The appointment of Prak Sokhonn is a little bit controversial because I think some ASEAN members think that it should not be the chair's decision to appoint a new envoy because the previous established envoy has not really been working yet, not allowed to work yet. The second point that I want to go back to your point about China, and you mentioned China, Japan, but what is China, from your view as an expert, Cambodian expert on Cambodia and on ASEAN, what does China want to see out of the Myanmar situation? What's the end game for China in Myanmar, Dr. Wanarit?
Thank you, Dr. Achan Thitinan. Very important questions. First, the legacy of Prime Minister Hun Sen. Of course, it will be the last summit under his leadership. So it would be the third time as a chair of ASEAN under one person, that is him. So he will commit to make a positive and good legacy within ASEAN. And of course, the 2012, as you mentioned earlier, it has reputational damage to Cambodia 10 years ago. So that is something that Cambodia need to kind of restore and rebrand Cambodia in a way that is a kind of responsible active member of ASEAN. Second question with regards to special envoy, of course, it depends on ASEAN decision. Cambodia cannot decide on this. So it yet to be confirmed, but wait for the consensus among ASEAN. So, but my personal point of view is we should not let this kind of appointment of special envoy to further divide ASEAN. No one will benefit from more divided and weakened ASEAN. Everyone will lose in this. So I hope that ASEAN members will find a consensus on this kind of arrangement of an ASEAN special envoy to Myanmar. And we need to take into consideration trust, personal relationship, especially trust, who Myanmar from different political factions and groups in Myanmar trust the most. That the matter of trust is, I think, very crucial in peace facilitations. Third question on Myanmar or Japan or China. I personally think that what China is trying to do is to bring the relevance of the military in this political settlement, because from the Chinese point of view, any political solution in Myanmar, you need to bring the military into this process, and also need to provide a certain security and guarantee without, let's say, punishment, a legal measure to punish the military leaders with regard to the crimes against humanity and so on. So this is the win-win policy that Cambodia used to have, is to forgive the former Khmer Rouge for the crime that they committed. So they only trial under the hybrid court, Cambodian UN court, only few senior Khmer Rouge leaders are only brought to the court. It's more symbolic justice. So this is kind of a kind of reconciliation process, is to forgive. Mutual forgiveness. So that is important. I think what China is trying to do is to ensure that the military stay relevant and is part of the solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wanarit. We just have about 45 minutes left, and you're our main view from the Cambodian chairmanship. So we like to ask you to stay on if you can, and we'll come right back to you. I'm just going to go to Ajahn Dr. Paridi Muitrakoon from Chiang Mai University, who's written books and articles on ASEAN. She's joining us for the first time for ISIS Thailand, so warm welcome. And you've been working on, Ajahn Paridi, on the ASEAN reforms. I mean, the whole structure, and we can see these divisions and divergences, on each issue. South China Sea, there's two camps. Mekong dams, two camps, and then Myanmar, two sides within ASEAN. Does this mean that ASEAN needs to really look at itself, how it works, the mechanisms, and maybe even an ASEAN charter? What can be done to maybe reform and streamline and shake up the ASEAN institutional framework and decision making to maintain ASEAN centrality?
Well, thank you very much, Ajahn Thitinan, for organizing this webinar, and also for having me here. I am very honored. Before going back to your question, next, can you please put up the slide? Thank you. Yeah, I would like to, next slide, please. Yes, I would like to bring you back, looking back to the changes and also incidents over the past 14 years first. Yeah, because that was the time when there was a decision to establish an ASEAN community, and also the last major organizational restructuring upon the adoption of the ASEAN Charter in 2007. We have seen many changes, and many of these are positive changes. Yeah, on the economic front, there has been a slow but steady progress in terms of integration. ASEAN, intra-ASEAN trade and also extra-ASEAN trade have grown from the mid-2000s until before the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has contributed to an improved economic condition in many countries. Cambodia reached the lower middle income status in 2015. And this year, it has met the criteria for LDC graduation. And apart from that, on the political front, we had the establishment of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Aung San Suu Kyi was released in 2010. And after that, there was a reform process in Myanmar. And in 2014, the country took up the ASEAN chairmanship, which signified an increasing commitment to the country to engage with ASEAN. Next slide. Despite the positive changes, we also saw growing disunity as shown in the absence of ASEAN joint statement in 2012. And about 2 years after that, we saw a coup d'etat here in Thailand. And again, last year, we saw a military coup, which is followed by a multifaceted crisis in Myanmar. Now, with the military takeovers, the COVID-19 pandemic, rivalry of big powers in the region, worsening situation in Myanmar, the uncertainty, the problem with the Mekong River, and also many other unresolved problems like transnational crime, cybersecurity, the haze, the climate change, the South China Sea dispute. It is somehow clear that ASEAN has been too slow and also too ineffective to deal with these issues. And why one can argue that we shouldn't expect too much from ASEAN, because the organization operates through consensus, and it comprises mostly developing countries, and that ASEAN is also not a military alliance that can give a certain level of security and assurance to its members. But we cannot deny that ASEAN could have done better in many aspects. especially in implementing and also carrying out important plans and policies to improve existing arrangements and also mechanisms. To give you an example, Article 50 of the ASEAN Charter states that the Charter may be reviewed 5 years after its entry into force or as otherwise determined by the ASEAN Summit. Until now, a complete review has not taken place, although there have been suggestions from some member states and also regional bodies like the High-Level Task Force and ASEAN Track 2 that certain organs and mechanisms should be reviewed and strengthened. The joint communique of the 54th ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting from August this year also has only a brief mentioning of the review, saying that the scoping report is underway, but it is unclear when the review is going to happen. So considering the delays and the inability to implement regional plans and respond to regional problems in a convincing manner, ASEAN has not been a credible and effective organization that its member can really rely on. Next slide, please. And this is very much reflected in Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Sen's response to the criticisms against his government's over-reliance on Beijing earlier this year. He said, if I don't rely on China, who will I rely on? And if I don't ask China, who am I to ask? Well, reading such a response, one may wonder how about ASEAN and what has ASEAN been doing? Certainly, different preferences and strategic alliance are nothing new here in Southeast Asia. But after decades of dialogues and cooperation, ASEAN members are expected to act more cohesively and more effectively. And the issues of ASEAN unity and effectiveness have been raised time and again during the past several decades, and changes that have occurred have not yet met the expectation of those who want to see ASEAN play a more decisive and effective role and become a truly robust regional organization. Next, please. In my view, the problems exist at both the national and also regional levels. At the national level, many member states do not possess the capacity to implement many of the regional plans and policies, which require effective bureaucracy, effective enforcement, transparency, investment, more funding, more multi-stakeholder engagement. And unfortunately, ASEAN cannot do much about this, because the reform of the domestic arrangements depends largely on the member states and their governments. And there are also many other shortcomings at the regional level as well. I mean, there's no secret about this. For example, in the issue of the haze, which affects the region every year, both in maritime Southeast Asia and also increasingly become an issue here in mainland Southeast Asia. Well, the ASEAN Haze Fund is way too limited to finance many activities across the region. The ASEAN Haze Free Roadmap that was implemented between 2015 and 2020 has also failed to engage non-state actors adequately, and a number of civil society organizations and their initiative to prevent land and forest fires and the haze are connected to neither their respected governments or ASEAN. The midterm review of the roadmap also didn't take place. And similarly, in the issue of human rights, there is a provision on the review of the terms of reference, or the TOR, of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, which should take place 5 years after its entry into force. Now, after so many discussions, a panel of experts remains to be set up to review the TOR. Next, please. Another is the ASEAN Secretariat, or ASEC, which is known for being too small and has too little budget, too little mandate, too little capacity to act as ASEAN's nerve center. And indeed, ASEC has the potential to play a more vigorous role in facilitating policy creation and also implementation, and also in developing ASEAN's common voice and position in major important issues. ASEC organizes more than 1,000 meetings a year, but until now, many of these meetings have been unable to ensure a common understanding and a common voice of the region. Too many times in important issues like the South China Sea, our leaders agree to disagree because they have diverging views and because of the prevalence of distrust that exists here in the region. Apart from that, experts and non-state actors who are so crucial to the realization and success of the regional plans have not been integrated in the ASEAN process. So the government must overcome this trust not only towards one another, but also towards these non-state actors. Next, please. So a comprehensive reform is certainly needed in order to make ASEAN the central platform that its members can really rely on and turn to in managing regional challenges and also in managing external relations, especially with the big powers. And if this is not yet possible, it should at least respect all the schedules and also deadlines and implement the regional plans and activities that are necessary to move the region forward. The last point that I want to make concerns the recurrence of violence and also human rights crisis. I think I share the view with Ms. Lina Alexandra. Last month, ASEAN has earned praise from some observers for not allowing the junta to politically represent Myanmar at the regional summit. The question is, should this kind of measure and pressure continue and also be intensified if the junta remains uncooperative? Of course, it is very important to maintain dialogue and continue the engagement and also to step up cooperation that would lead to reconciliation and peace restoration. But ASEAN must also draw a red line. The member governments, especially those who are inspired to become the future government through the use of violence and other undemocratic means, should know what to expect if the red line is being crossed. Taking Myanmar as an example, if the situation does not improve and the troubled government continues to turn a deaf ear to ASEAN, should it be barred from attending all the regional meetings and forums? Can its membership be suspended? Here, both the red line and also the countermeasures must be discussed and, if possible, institutionalized in the future. That's all from me now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Purdy. Just a very quick 1 minute follow-up to you. The ASEAN way has been working less and less effectively. And what if ASEAN moves towards not just a consensus-based, but in some cases, under certain conditions, majority voting? How would that be? Would that be one major reform area, majority voting away from consensus under certain conditions in some cases? What do you think?
I think this is going to be a great idea to have this majority voting, but whether this is going to be possible, because it was required a consensus, first of all, for ASEAN states, all of them have to agree on this, right? And I think with the situation now, it doesn't look so promising, but of course, this is going to be great if it can really happen.
Okay, is Dr. Wanarit back, our tech team? Dr. Wanarit, if you can hear this, we'd like to have you reconnected. Let me come to Gwen Robinson and Lina Alexandra. We've been talking a lot about Myanmar, but in fact, ASEAN, is beyond Myanmar. There are issues of division and challenges, especially from outside. And when Dr. Wanarit comes back on, I want to ask him about China and Cambodia. whether we will see, we're still haunted by that experience 10 years ago, whether we'll see a repeat of that, and to what extent Cambodia is still doing China's bidding. But on further issues, broader issues, maybe Lena, you first. The South China Sea is the conundrum, right? So it looks like nothing is going to change there, and it's becoming an arena of contest. And together with the Taiwan cross-strait Taiwan issue, this is not a good strategic environment. We're seeing tensions, but we could possibly see conflict. What's the chance of that? It's very alarming. People talk about outright conflict now. We've not heard this before, but I think it's been encouraged for the last several months, last year or so. It doesn't look good for this confrontation between US and China. Lina, what would you have to say? Can we see open conflict?
Well, thank you, Dr. Titinan. I think, of course, looking at the recent developments, there are a lot of indicators that there might be some open conflict. But from my side, I don't think there will be an open arms clash very soon. And especially, of course, with the issue of Taiwan's trade relations with China. From my reading, I think if Dr. Parudi mentioned about the red line, as long as Taiwan has not mentioned about the red line itself, which is independence from China, I don't think there will be an open armed conflict between the two, because to some extent China is also, especially with the post-pandemic recovery, I think the issue, the priority, of course, on how to keep up with the economic growth and so on and so forth. And of course, if you happen to resort to war or open armed conflict, of course, it will be too costly for everyone, and including for China. And in the South China Sea issue, I think, of course, this is the major issue for ASEAN. Although Indonesia, again, is not party to the conflict itself in South China Sea. But of course, as you see, there are some incidents that involve the EEZ area of Indonesia in the Natuna area. But again, I think it's pretty much the same with the Myanmar crisis itself. It depends very much on the ASEAN unity in dealing with this issue, especially vis-a-vis China. And the bottom line that I think we need to convey to China, if China, as it has promised from the outset, it will become a benign hegemonic power, it needs to show, if it seeks to become a superpower in the future, it needs to observe the international order, the international principles on how the international system, international order should work. Otherwise, without doing so, the legitimacy for being a superpower, I don't think it is. I don't think China can secure its position as a superpower. So again, I think all these major powers were always trying to seek for influence, like spread their influence and divide ASEAN. So the real challenge is really within ASEAN itself, on how they can come up with the coherent response in dealing with this major power tension.
Thank you, Lina. Just a 1 minute follow-up to what you just said. The Myanmar crisis, we've seen the Brunei chair has had to grapple with it, and next will be Cambodia as chair. And Indonesia has been trying to do more on Myanmar than what the chair has been able to come up with. In the case of Cambodia, do you think this will Indonesia be frustrated again if the chair does not do enough on Myanmar? That's one question. By the way, this question comes from our colleague in the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace, CICP, in Phnom Penh. And he also has another question, Raksami him, that Indonesia will be next after Cambodia. So is Indonesia already thinking about what to do with ASEAN? Any forward thinking already? What needs to be done with ASEAN in order to regain unity and centrality? So 2 questions for you quickly, Dr. Lina and Alexandra.
Okay, thank you for the question. First, I think, of course, it was unfortunate for Brunei that the Myanmar crisis just suddenly fell into its lap during its chairmanship. Nobody, even Indonesia, I don't think we of course we don't expect that something as big as Myanmar crisis just fell into our lap during our chairmanship. So it's really challenging. It's very difficult situation that Brunei has been facing during its chairmanship, and we must, I think, show some empathy to some extent with this. And with Cambodia, of course, learning from what Brunei has done before, I think Cambodia has more how to say has more experience. They should be able to learn some lessons from what Brunei did before. Some good things must continue, but some mistakes or errors must be improved, I think, to be able for Cambodia to be successful in its chairmanship. And the question whether Indonesia and the other ASEAN member states that are quite progressive in this Myanmar crisis might be disappointed or not. I think it's quite unfair to judge from the beginning to say, okay, we will be quite frustrated with the Cambodian chairmanship because it has not started yet. So we must give the opportunity, of course, for Cambodia. And the most important thing is how we can support as fellow ASEAN member states, how we can lend our support for Cambodia, full support on how Cambodia should shape its approach in Myanmar crisis to be able to drive ASEAN to effectively dealing with the crisis. I think that should be the approach that we are taking. And regarding Indonesia's position as a chairman in 2023, I think it is obvious there is Indonesian interest to make sure that when we are taking up the chairmanship in 2023, it will be a successful one. And this cannot be separated from Cambodia's success itself next year in 2022. So that's why we have quite strong interest on how we can collaborate with Cambodia on how to set up the basis, especially in dealing with the Myanmar crisis regarding the special envoy, on how to institutionalize this special envoy. It could be that the special envoy doesn't need to follow the rotating position of the chair, because as I mentioned earlier, this is a huge and complex crisis to take up, to deal, to be dealt by ASEAN. So definitely a 1-year term for a special envoy. It is hard for us to see any fruit to come up within only 1-year term of special envoy. So I think, that's how we can respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lina. And Gwen, I'm just going to put you on hold just for a second to dial in Dr. Wanarit. Are you there, Dr. Wanarit? If you're there, okay. Gwen Robinson, the Myanmar crisis, it looks intractable now on the ground. I mean, the battlefield situation, the Myanmar military, they have the force of arms, have heavier weapons. They can do a lot of damage, but they cannot really gain control over the country. The opposition groups, some armed, also cannot gain control of the country. Do you think this will have to actually lead to some kind of a international brokerage, international solution, sponsored by some kind of a UN structure or international players? What do you think to find a way forward in the Myanmar morass, crisis?
Well, it is a good question, and I'd like to answer it in a way that has bearing on Cambodia's chairmanship of ASEAN as well. But as you say, Dr. Titinan, the stakes are far bigger than ASEAN, and the requirements are for a far higher level of decision-making and possible intervention. All the indications in recent weeks show that both sides, particularly the National Unity Government, which kind of represents a lot of the resistance to the junta, and the junta itself have hardened their lines. There is absolute refusal on both sides to countenance talking to each other. I think the international intervention question or involvement has been, it's been 9 months since the coup, and we've just seen this terrible escalating violence, and nothing can be done. The real block is at the top, at the UN Security Council, and as has been made very clear, both China and Russia, which hold veto power, have refused to sign on to any kind of resolution that would really hit Myanmar or the junta. So barring some kind of extraordinary change of heart of those two countries, I think not much more can be done, and the only solution might be some kind of military intervention. How it feeds into ASEAN, I think, is I'd just like to go back to what some of my fellow panelists raised. There was a very, very interesting comment that Hun Sen, as the incoming chair of ASEAN, made at the end of the last summit, and it was extraordinarily hard line, actually, saying that the entire reason Myanmar was not represented at the summit was all Myanmar's fault. That and he made it very clear that he wouldn't look very benignly on prospects for the junta. So I think that was possibly a diversion. And on this issue of whether Hun Sen, as chair, can avoid the kind of paralysis that we saw when Phnom Penh last hosted the summit so many years ago over the South China Sea issue, I think what's clear is the South China Sea issue has gone way out of ASEAN hands, and it's really, as you said, Dr. Titinana, about China, Taiwan, the US. The stakes are far higher and far broader. ASEAN, the kind of South China Sea code of conduct issue that ASEAN has tied itself in knots about for years is kind of dead. China has what it wants in the South China Sea in terms of where ASEAN is at. So I think that is driving both China and US positions regarding ASEAN. And China is, with its special summit on Monday, it's just 1 month since it last hosted an ASEAN summit. It wants to make a grand splash marking the 30th anniversary of ASEAN with China, and it's accelerating investment in BRI-related, Belt and Road Initiative-related projects in ASEAN countries. It really is making a push because it's very concerned about losing out, as some of my colleagues mentioned, to Japan, but also the US. And what's also clear, I think, from reading between the lines of the US position on Myanmar and the junta, is that the US actually wouldn't mind at all if ASEAN expelled Myanmar. And it's very clear that there is no engagement on the part of the US with the junta. So I think those two sides, even though the US and China are absolutely critical to what happens in Myanmar next, particularly China being on the border and heavily involved with both investment, infrastructure, and, let's say, its relationship with the ethnic armed groups, particularly along the border. It has tremendous influence, but it's playing all sides at the moment and clearly wants ASEAN unity, and therefore would be much more prepared to keep trying to engage the junta and keep ASEAN united, whereas the US is kind of, I think, taking a much harder line. So they're the kind of considerations, I think, for Hun Sen. But right now, I think Hun Sen is really focused on trying to rescue his star role as host of ASEM, Asia-Europe Summit, which, as we know, involves 51 countries and 2 organizations, ASEAN and Brussels. And it's very clear that Brussels has no desire to have Min Aung Hlaing at that meeting. So, a lot of challenges for Hun Sen and China and the US.
Yes, thank you, Gwen. Also, this should remind us, that the ASEAN narrative of having 10 member states and 660 million market and population combined, GDP of more than $3 trillion, all of that. That narrative now is missing a significant link because Myanmar is out of action, and we're looking at ASEAN 9, not ASEAN 10. This is the first time that we're seeing ASEAN 9 members since they came into 10 composition grouping in 1999. So it's unprecedented, I think profound, and I don't see, I mean, do you see any way of Myanmar kind of regaining stability and rejoining the ASEAN fold? I don't see it, which means ASEAN has to make a choice. Either it takes in Myanmar, the military, SAC, and loses international acceptance and credibility, and basically including the Myanmar military is basically effectively excluding the major dialogue partners. But there seems to be no way out of that.
I agree with you, and I think Hun Sen said it all with that great line at the summit towards the end saying, we are ASEAN -1. And maybe ASEAN -1 is going to be, I just don't see, and if, as we know from the way things are heading, Myanmar spirals further downwards, I would not rule out this option of considering either suspending Myanmar's membership or possibly expelling. Of course, unprecedented, and the ASEAN Charter has no provision to expel or even suspend a member, but this might be a turning point for ASEAN, and it would be up to Hun Sen as ASEAN chair to maybe drive that kind of debate about reassessing, and definitely he will have to drive a debate about reassessing this centrality and non-interference principle. I don't see that ASEAN is more united than ever. It's more divided than ever because of this -1 issue. So, I think it's going to be a very interesting year for Cambodia's chair.
Yeah, thank you. Lina, for Indonesia, the Indonesia must be torn and frustrated because on the one hand, ASEAN is very important to Indonesia, but Indonesia also has other platforms and forums to put. I mean, the G20, for example, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, OIC, for example, and then being the third largest democracy. So Indonesia has a lot of pull. Would it go beyond ASEAN and just give, what do you think is the thinking behind the strategic elites and leaders in Indonesia? To what extent will they put up with this kind of ASEAN inertia and inaction and squandering Indonesia's own geostrategic capital? Or at which point do they just move beyond ASEAN, Lina?
Well, I think on the one hand, of course, there has been quite some discussion whether Indonesia should look into another platform than ASEAN. So basically, the point is, okay, we can refer to ASEAN if the issue is right, if the issue is within the ASEAN scope to deal with, then we use ASEAN. But then if not, we go to another platforms. That's the main point. But as much as we want to do that, I think for obvious reasons, geographically, we cannot neglect ASEAN. So the issue is on I think we cannot just push it away there because we still need ASEAN to some extent to mitigate the situation, and especially if there is an immediate crisis in the region. There's no other platform that we can use to do so, despite all the weaknesses that we have with ASEAN. But on the other hand, I think Indonesia should be quite strategic in this. As much as we want to push ASEAN to grow as an institution, it has been established for almost for 5 decades now, so it should grow actually. And I want to relate back to what Parudi mentioned earlier about the review of the charter. I think it is. Some might say it's already too late, but it's actually okay. that is, we cannot say it's too late, but it is still timely to do the review of the charter. So ASEAN that we have now is a different ASEAN. ASEAN back then was ASEAN without charter, but ASEAN that we have now is ASEAN with charter. So there should be it has a legal basis on how to regulate the interactions among the member states, as well as how the regional organization should deal with the various challenges that it has been facing. So the review of the charter is very important, and Indonesia should pursue on how to strengthen ASEAN through revising the charter itself, to contain the provisions that enable ASEAN to deal with the emerging issues that ASEAN has not been facing in the past during its early establishment. So I think I don't know whether I answered to your question, but the fact that Indonesia should explore other platforms, we still cannot neglect ASEAN. The thing that we can do is still to do our maximum effort to strengthen ASEAN. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Lina. Look, we have about 10 minutes, so I want to use this as a kind of a free range discussion. Everything is on, you can talk about anything, but the question is this: why is ASEAN so stuck, and what can really be done? I'm just going to come to Dr. Paridi. It's unimaginable that Southeast Asia would be without ASEAN. 54 years ago, when ASEAN came into being, it has been the linchpin, the foundation, organization for the region. But now, I think it's at its weakest point, lowest point, lacking credibility, effectiveness, losing the centrality, unity on a range of issues. And so Dr. Paridi, even though it's unimaginable to see the region without ASEAN, could ASEAN actually break up? I mean, if you have ASEAN only among Indonesia, Malaysia, the original five, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, and Thailand, it could do a lot more. Should that be a way forward?
To be honest, I am an ASEAN supporter, even though I'm quite critical about the organization. Yeah, I don't think we have that many options, because without ASEAN, then what? And I think the problem is that we are somehow attached to this kind of narrative of ASEAN has to be 10, the ASEAN 10. Yeah, and that also affects the way all the mechanisms and arrangements are being created, that everybody should be on board, we cannot leave anyone. But now what we have seen this ASEAN -1, and in the economic front we have the ASEAN -X. Yeah, so actually I think ASEAN is not a static organization. It is changing, but it just it changes too slowly. That is the problem. Yeah, and I don't think it's going to be that beneficial if ASEAN would break, and if we would go back to the ASEAN 5, because I mean a lot of things have happened over the past 2-3 decades, and ASEAN have been integrated to the extent that we cannot go back to the ASEAN 5 anymore. And also with the political situation now, I mean, especially for Thailand, I mean, we will be badly affected by the refugees crisis, what Gwen has just mentioned. So for me, ASEAN will continue, yeah, and ASEAN should also continue to exist, but it should somehow step up its own cooperation, and the member state would have to really get together and speak to one another in an open and frank manner as well. Otherwise, I don't think ASEAN would remain frustratingly unable to really deal with and manage the regional challenges. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It was a rhetorical question in a way, but also, a realistic one. Not a physical breakup per se, but functionally, it's becoming less and less, relevant. So the inertia in action, I think, should galvanize the member states to close ranks and get the house in order. Moving to Lina a little bit, Lina, moving forward, I mean, Indonesia will have the chair, and we know about the ASEAN the structure and mechanisms and so on. And Cambodia, I think, at this time, I think China is also at a weak point. The reopening, pandemic reopening, will be delayed, I think. And China has internal stress. The 20th Party Congress, Winter Olympics coming up, the Xi Jinping's presidency's third term prospective, probable third term. A lot of internal stress. Outside, there's a lot of pressure on China. The AUKUS, Australia, UK, US, the Quad, the US pressure, Australia trade and tariff war with China. And all around China, you have countries that oppose. I mean, Japan, India, Vietnam, Philippines. And I'm afraid that China could overreact, and this is a time of vulnerability. So in that broad mix, ASEAN we still want to have ASEAN around, because without ASEAN, the region would be much more chaotic, unstable, and volatile, and all kinds of things can happen. This is why ASEAN came to being, to provide some stability for the region, some strategic autonomy for the region, economic development, and to stop the internal conflicts within the ASEAN, among ASEAN member states. But now, moving forward, the strategic environment is very alarming, and I don't know what ASEAN can do. We talk about ASEAN, but Indonesia will be looked upon as the lead role. And from Jakarta, do you sense frustrations? We know, but any forward thinking about how to maintain the stability of the region, the unity and centrality of ASEAN? Lina?
Well, I think with the idea of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, that's how Indonesia trying to construct the idea on how to for ASEAN to face the tensions among the major powers. As you correctly pointed out, that of course, in that sense, we still need ASEAN to be able to stand together in facing the rising China as well as the other major powers. So overall, the overall major powers rivalry in the region. So because we know if we stand by ourselves, it is quite difficult on how to face these major powers. But again, I think with this AOIP, I think there is some key some questions there. Of course, we need to still flesh out many of the points to make it more concrete to be able to be implemented. But again, I think what we are thinking in Indonesia now, of course, on how to regain the leadership in ASEAN. Being a leader is not in a hierarchical sense, meaning that Indonesia is above the other member states, but in showing leadership, meaning to give the direction on how ASEAN should move forward, especially in facing these major powers relations. And the other issue is on how to the other issue is how to make to transform ASEAN, not necessarily ASEAN, but on how to encapsulate the relations between the Southeast Asia countries and the dialogue partners in reinvoking the East Asia Summit, EAS, basically, because this is actually the main platform that we can. In the past, it has been established, but it has addressed so many issues, the periphery issues to some extent. Although the member states, the members of EAS actually involve the major power itself. So the idea now is how to reinvoke, rejuvenate the East Asia Summit to be able to have a platform together with the major powers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll move to Gwen Robinson. Gwen, you've been working on and in Southeast Asia for several decades. I mean, this must be, I don't know for you, but for me, a very alarming time. We've not seen this before, the intensifying rivalry competition, US-China, but also the internal weakness of ASEAN, and the latest being the Myanmar Coup crisis that ASEAN has not been able to address squarely. So moving forward, I mean, you have a lot of sources, I know, and you spend a lot of time in Japan. Maybe a little bit of what would Japan like to see out of this mix in Myanmar, first of all, and in the broader ASEAN, challenges and developments moving forward.
Well, it's a really good point, Titinan. We also saw, I didn't say that in this recent flurry of diplomacy going around in Naypyidaw, another figure that cropped up very quietly was the head of the very influential head of the Japan-Myanmar Association, Hideo Watanabe. So we had Hideo Watanabe and Sasakawa both there, and both apparently involved in the release of the US journalist, but also many, many other things. And Watanabe is a driving factor in a lot of the Japanese investment interest, and very substantial investment in Myanmar. A lot of analysts believe that Japan's interest is primarily economic, and you can see you can't see it directly in informal investment figures, because a lot of Japanese investment is done through Singapore, which is why Singapore figures so highly on the investment league for Myanmar. But there are both economic and, I think, broader strategic issues. Let's not forget that Japan has just had a big change of leadership. There's a new administration, a new foreign minister. Of course, most people don't believe Japan ever really changes as long as it's the same ruling party, the LDP. But the new Prime Minister, Kishida, has shown some more active interest in both diplomacy and also, I think, interest in engaging internationally. So I think the other thing that is really driving Japan, which is also what is a factor in China's increased determination to not only stay involved in Myanmar but influence events, is the concerns about China's encroachment in the region and its steadily increasing hold, particularly in the so-called mainland Southeast Asia region. And of course, China as well was not happy at all to see Sasakawa crop up. And interestingly, Sasakawa's main role in recent years has been both to funnel aid from his organisation and the government, and also get involved in the peace process with ethnic armed groups. And it looks like right now he's also getting very involved in that. So I think Japan has multifold interests there, and most of all, I think, to buffer, to counterbalance China.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gwen. Unfortunately, our time is up. It's also very unfortunate that our Cambodian speaker, Dr. Wanrit, has not been able to join for the whole session. But I want to thank everyone. Some of the questions that remain to be seen and addressed is the internal dynamics of Cambodia as well, the opposition, and that how Prime Minister Hun Sen will juggle and address all these internal challenges and external pressure and trying to somehow secure its legacy. But I'm sure we will hear more on those issues as the days and months move forward under Cambodia's chairmanship. Thank you very much to all the audience participants, to all the speakers here, Dr. Wanrit, Gwen Robinson, Dr. Lina Alexandra, and Dr. Purdy Muitrakund, and all from me here. Thank you very much. Thank you.